In the Viking Age, childhood didn't start with a celebration, it started with a test. When a baby was born, the father had a very hard choice to make. This choice was called setting out. He would look at the newborn and check for strength. He looked to see if the legs were straight, if the eyes were clear, and if the baby had a loud, healthy cry. In a world of ice, deep snow, and hungry wolves, there was no room for weakness. If a baby was born very sick or had a body that wouldn't let them work the farms, the family faced a grim reality. Life was so hard that many believed a weak child wouldn't survive the first winter anyway. It sounds cruel to us today, but the Vikings believed they were sparing the child from a life of suffering. If the father decided the baby was strong, he would perform a ceremony. He would sprinkle water on the infant and give them a name, often naming them after a brave ancestor or a god like Thor. Once a child was named, they were officially part of the family and protected by its honor. But from that first day, the message was clear. Strength was the only way to stay alive in the north. Viking children did not have playtime in the way we think of it. From the moment they could walk steadily on their own 2 feet, they had jobs that actually mattered to the family's survival. The Vikings lived on rocky, cold farms where nature was often an enemy. There were no grocery stores or heaters. If the chores didn't get done, the family simply didn't eat, or they froze in the night. Toddlers as young as 4 or 5 were expected to contribute. Their first job was usually gathering firewood. They had to carry heavy bundles of sticks through the snow to keep the great hearth fire in the center of the longhouse burning. They also spent hours in the woods gathering berries, nuts, and wild herbs. This was a dangerous job because they had to learn exactly which plants were food and which ones were poisonous. There were no labels or books to help them. They had to memorize everything their elders told them. If they made a mistake, the consequences were deadly. As they got older, the work got even tougher. Children were the guardians of the fire. Keeping the hearth burning was a sacred duty. If the fire went out in the middle of a winter night, the whole family could freeze before morning. They also became the shepherds of the family's animals. Young children watched over the sheep and goats, protecting them from wolves and bears in the high mountains. They had to be brave enough to stand their ground and smart enough to lead the animals home before a storm hit. Inside the longhouse, the work never stopped. Everyone, even the youngest, learned to work with wool. They helped shear the sheep, wash the wool, and spin it into thread. They spent hours helping the women weave the thick, scratchy cloaks that kept the wind out during sea voyages. In a Viking home, there was no such thing as saying, "I'm tired," or "I'll do it later." Everyone worked until the sun went down, and often by the light of the fire long after dark. Viking parents loved their children deeply, but they didn't want them to be soft. They knew that one day these children would have to fight off raiders or hunt dangerous animals. To prepare. Them Viking toys were actually tools for war. Boys were given small wooden swords, shields, and axes as soon as they could grip them. They didn't just swing them at trees for fun, they wrestled in the mud and fought each other in games that were often very violent. If a boy got a cut, a broken nose, or a deep bruise, he wasn't given a bandage or a hug. He was told to stand up and keep fighting. Tears were seen as a sign that your spirit was weak, and a weak spirit was a death sentence. They also had to become masters of the bow and arrow. A Viking child had to be able to hunt a deer from far away and move silently through the forest so the animals and the enemies wouldn't hear them coming. They weren't just playing, they were practicing to be the most feared warriors on earth. By the age of 7, many boys were already learning how to handle a real iron knife. In the Viking world, boys and girls had different lives, but both paths were incredibly difficult and required great courage. Boys were raised to be the outward strength of the family. They spent their time outside in the rain and snow, learning how to build sturdy oak ships, how to sail through giant waves that could swallow a boat, and how to use a heavy shield in a shield wall. By the age of 12, a boy was often considered a man. It was not uncommon for a 12-year-old to go on his first sea voyage to a foreign land, leaving his home behind to prove his bravery. Girls stayed closer to the longhouse, but their work was just as vital to the clan. A Viking woman was the heart of the farm, and she ran everything when the men were away on voyages for months at a time. This meant girls had to learn how to manage food for dozens of people, how to preserve meat with salt, and how to make every piece of clothing the family wore. They also learned the secrets of medicine. They knew which moss could stop a wound from bleeding and which roots could break a dangerous fever. A Viking girl grew up to be the boss of the home. When she became a woman, she would carry the iron keys to the food chests and the doors on her dress, showing everyone that she was in charge of the family's wealth and survival. Life for a Viking child was full of danger because there were no doctors, hospitals, or modern medicines. A simple scratch from a rusty tool or a bite from a farm animal could become deadly if it got infected. A bad winter meant there wasn't enough grain or dried meat, and the children were often the ones who went hungry first so the workers could stay strong. Sadly, history tells us that about half of all Viking children did not live to see their 7th birthday. Because death was always close, Vikings looked at life differently than we do. They believed your fate was already decided by the Norns, the goddesses of destiny. If it was your time to go, nothing could save you. If it wasn't your time, nothing could kill you. This mindset made them incredibly brave. They didn't cry over the inevitable. If a child got sick, they were expected to be tough and endure the pain without complaining. This hardness was what allowed them to survive in a land that seemed to want them dead. Viking children didn't have books, desks, or schools. They didn't learn their ABCs or how to do long division. Instead, they had the sagas. Every night, as the cold wind howled outside the wooden walls, the family gathered around the central fire to hear the elders tell stories. These were stories of heroes who fought giants, dragons that guarded gold, and the great gods like Thor with his hammer and Odin with his one eye. These stories were their lessons. They weren't just for entertainment. They taught the children the Viking code of honor. They learned that a person is remembered for their courage and their character, not for how many things they owned. They learned that loyalty to the family was the most important thing in the world. A Viking child grew up wanting to be a hero whose name would be spoken by the fire for 1,000 years. They didn't want to be safe, they wanted to be great. By the time a child reached 12 or 15, their childhood was completely over. There were no teenagers in the Viking Age. You were either a child who needed protection or an adult who provided it. A boy would receive his first real iron sword and join the men in the fields or on the ships. A girl might get married and take over the massive responsibility of running her own farm. They had seen more, worked harder, and survived more danger than most adults do in our world today. We might look at the Vikings and think their life was mean or cruel. We might feel sorry for the children who had to work in the freezing cold or fight with wooden swords until they bled. However, this hard life created a people so strong they explored the entire world. They sailed to America, Africa, and Russia in small wooden boats guided only by the stars. Viking children grew up fast because survival demanded it. They didn't have the luxury of being kids. They had to be legends. Next time you feel like your life is difficult, remember the Viking child who stood in the snow, axe in hand, ready to take on the world.